Welcome back. In our time together, we will continue our study of Genesis. If you recall, in our last session, we explored the story of creation and what it told us about God, the world, and ourselves. This week's study takes us in a different direction. Genesis chapters 3 through 11 help us understand what happened to the goodness and purity of creation. They help answer the questions about why we struggle with our sin nature, God, and with others around us. In all of these struggles, the central issue is sin. This passage of Scripture helps us understand what sin is, its consequences with God, and its consequences with others and the world around us. We begin by exploring the story in Genesis chapter 3. Recall how God gave the Garden of Eden to Adam and Eve with one simple rule: do not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The story of the first sin begins with temptation. This is a story that we know all too well because we repeat it in our lives constantly. Notice how the serpent cleverly twisted the way Adam and Eve understood the expectations of God. Recall Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, and Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. In both of these passages, temptation and sin are both a result of corrupting the goodness God created. For example, a desire to work and earn money to provide for ourselves and our families is good. But if we put too much emphasis on money, we can easily fall into greed. God also creates beauty, but if we become consumed with physical appearances and the desire for things that aren't ours, our quest for beauty turns into lustfulness. Adam and Eve thought they knew better than the all-powerful, all-loving God who created them. They chose to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil because the serpent manipulated their desire to become wise like God. Adam and Eve's mistake seems foolish. However, we can all recall times in our lives when we too have acted on a temptation instead of choosing the path of righteousness. The second half of chapter 3 focuses on the consequences of sin. The consequences of our sin not only impact us, but they also affect those who surround us, our family and friends. Did you notice in the story that the first consequence Adam and Eve experienced was a sense of shame? If you compare Genesis chapter 2, verse 25, and chapter 3, verse 7, you see that Adam and Eve were now ashamed of their nakedness. They were naked before they ate from the tree, but their sin changed their perspective and corrupted what God had made to be pure. Their sin made them see themselves and each other in a new and negative way, and now they felt shame for what God had created. Do you remember how they responded when they heard God walking in the garden? They ran and hid because of the embarrassment they felt. In a similar way, our sin compels us to hide from the goodness and purity of God. This story illustrates how Adam and Eve, much like us, could not take responsibility for their sin, but instead they blamed others. Adam blamed Eve and God, and Eve blamed the serpent. Likewise, our sin also keeps us from being honest with ourselves and others. Often, we don't want to admit our failures. The consequences of Adam and Eve's sin did not end there. Recall the other passages you read in the rest of Genesis chapter 3 and chapter 4. Their sin also infected the land and their relationships with others. Because of sin, the ground was cursed. Great pain came with childbirth, and the story of Cain and Abel illustrates how we are constantly struggling with jealousy and anger. This account of the first sin helps us understand a key feature about sin. Sin and its consequences are never just personal. We often think of sin as a private matter between God and ourselves. However, as this story clearly illustrates, our sin has a significant impact on the world around us. For example, think of a secret addiction a person can have, and no one knows except for God. It could be an addiction to money, to drugs, or pornography. All of these will significantly impact how that person relates to their family, their spouse, children, and friends. Sin is like that. It not only infects our hearts, but also our actions and relationships. This week, we also read from Genesis chapter 6 through 9 and explored the story of the ark. This story illustrates just how bad it can get. The story of the ark conveys, again, that sin has definite consequences. When we think of sin, we only see it as affecting our relationship with God, not our relationships with ourselves and others. Furthermore, we often think of God punishing us due to our sin. More often than not, God does not need to actively punish us. The natural consequence of our sin, of not aligning ourselves to God's will and the intended order of His creation, is a life of disorder, pain, and chaos. The story of the ark lets us know that God can and has punished humanity. The flood was a result of humanity's commitment to its sin nature and not to God. It's important to remember, however, that the stories of the judgment and the flood are also stories of grace, or God's compassion when we don't deserve it. Think of the disappointment the Father must have felt after Adam and Eve gave in to temptation. Recall in Genesis chapter 6, verse 6, when God grieved over creating humanity. The beauty of this story is that in the midst of God's disappointment and anger, we see His grace and mercy. Though God was so thoroughly disappointed in Adam and Eve, He did not destroy them. The story of the ark illustrates our abilities to believe and trust in God, just as Noah did. When Noah placed his trust in God, God showed His grace and mercy by sparing the lives of those humans and animals that were on the boat. And last, the rainbow is a symbol of God's mercy and grace. Every time you see a rainbow, it should be a reminder of God's grace and forgiveness. The last story we read was of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. This passage helps clarify the existence of the various cultures and people that inhabit the earth. In verse 4, we learn that the people built a city with a tower that reached to the heavens, and they selfishly did this to make a name for themselves. The people desired to be great like God, and their greedy desires ultimately caused their downfall. When the Lord saw the tower they were building, He scattered people all over the earth and gave them different languages. The reason for this was because the people thought they could be like God. When we separate ourselves from God, we try to fill the gap with our own abilities and even with other people. But, as the story teaches, we will never succeed in taking God's place. That ends our time together in this session. In the questions that follow, your task is to apply what you have learned in our study of Scripture today to the way you live out your life. In our next session, we will begin exploring the stories of the founding fathers of our faith, also called the patriarchs.